Hi there, I'm Hamza Dawood, and I'm a research lead at Queer Crescent.
And I'm Soraya Sharker, the organizing director of Queer Crescent.
Thank you all for coming to watch the data drop of our Presencing Ourselves survey. To give you a little backdrop on the project, this project was the first nationwide survey of queer and trans Muslims in the US, and we're really excited to share a slice of results from our February 22nd, 2023 webinar. Our hope with this work is to intervene in the invisibility of queer and trans Muslims and provide a needs assessment that can point towards ways to improve our material, social, and spiritual conditions.
A bit more about Queer Crescent. We're an organization that imagines futures where queer and trans Muslims are building possibilities towards collective liberation. We were formed as a political response to anti Muslim racism and queer pushout, and we actively affirm the multitude of ways Muslims live their lives. Our work is shaped by resisting gendered violence through cultural organizing, base building, and defining Muslimness as an expansive identity. You can find out more about us on our website and on Instagram.
And in acknowledgement of fullness, we must also name our grief and rage as the Zionist machine of Israel continues to commit genocide and war crimes against the Palestinian people, the people of Gaza, and an assault on all indigenous and third world peoples of conscience. On behalf of Queer Crescent, I want to thank all of you who have tirelessly shown up and out on the streets, through direct action, shutting down bridges, and through challenging power structures. In your homes, workplaces, colleges, schools, and all institutions continue to be complicit in Zionist racist violence. Because Queer Crescent deeply shaped by healing justice, we cannot begin our time today without acknowledging all the parts that exist in a complex moment of simultaneity. For now, let's get to the data.
So we wanted to start off this whole data drop with kind of a grounding in what the goals of the survey was, right? And first and foremost, it really started off as a community-based survey. It started off as a needs assessment survey that was stemming from a severe lack of data on queer and trans Muslims, right? We were going off of personal experiences in our work, and we realized that we need something that is a little more concrete than experiences, not to belittle oral histories and our experiences, but the world works in mysterious ways, and one of those ways relies on data. And we also had an intentional kind of reflection on our work at Queer Crescent, right? We had a desire to move away from more reactionary work to work that really predicts, advocates, and addresses our community's needs. So ultimately, the needs assessment really sought to understand queer and trans Muslims in the US, including kind of your typical demographic understanding of our communities and their diversity, as well as kind of like an experiential understanding that paints a picture of, their well-being and how our communities are actually doing in the current state. And this was in many, many different domains. So if you've taken the survey, you know that we ask questions across close to 9 different domains that have to do with belonging, with employment, with experiences with discrimination, relations to policing, religiosity, healthcare, among many, many more. So we really have this comprehensive data set that touches on many different aspects of queer and trans Muslim livelihood. All in all, we really wanted and continue to want the survey to be co-owned by us as Queer Crescent and by partner organizations and by the community that we serve, right? So that the work can forward collectively. We can't carry this work on our own, and this is one of many events that will come where we hope to collaborate together on actioning on some of the findings. So today we're going to share initial findings with you to kind of give you a snapshot of our demographics, as well as kind of some of our initial report is dealing with, which is we're really trying to have this report be a tool for political education on the origins of anti-Muslim racism, with a particular focus on anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism, the formations of anti-Muslim racism and its changes over the years, as well as kind of exploring through our an initial exploration of data, kind of how queer and trans Muslims feel in terms of their belonging, how are they connecting to organizations, and what are the material implications of that, when we look at particular experiences of life with policing, sexual assault, and sexual health. So with all of that in mind, we have a couple of questions for y'all to just keep in mind as we share this data with you. First is, how is this landing, right? We have a Q&A section, we have breakout rooms coming up, so write down notes if you're so inclined. What are the limitations of our work? We really want to consider those. And what do those limitations teach us? And then what further questions come up as you sit with the data and as you sit with some of the conclusions that we're coming at with the data and some of the gaps that are still outstanding. And now I'll pass it on to Amara to speak to survey design.
Hi, folks. As Shanaz mentioned, I've been with Queer Crescent for a long time, and I am also a research lead alongside Hamza. I'm also a PhD candidate in anthropology at the University of Chicago, and yeah, that data is fun. So let's go over some of the methodology for how this whole thing was created. The first step we did once we committed to doing this project was we assembled a question bank. A lot of it was based off of concerns we had ourselves as a group of a bunch of queer and trans Muslims. A lot of the rest of it was finding surveys that we thought were inspirational for such a project. Heart's Sexual Violence Study, the Black Census Project, the US Trans Survey, and ISPU's American Muslim Poll were all things we were looking at when we were thinking of this. And once we actually made that question bank, we put out an open call on Instagram and, wait, am I unmuted? Why does it say unmute myself? Odd. An open call was given on Instagram for people to review this question bank and also help set priorities. Since we had, I forget the exact number, but it was something in the range of 400 or 500 questions, and no one's taking a 400 or 500 question survey, not without being paid a lot of money. And we had gift cards. These people clicked various questions saying that they were must includes, highlighted particular areas that they wanted more questions for, and generally helped us narrow things down to a 162 questions, 30-minute max, ideally, survey. I say max because some people saw more questions than others. If you were trans, you saw some questions about gender. Other people didn't. If you were an immigrant or a refugee, same thing for those experiences. With these questions, we then put them into Qualtrics, which is one of the standard platforms for running surveys. It's used in academia, it's used in healthcare, it's used in business contexts. It was very secure, and this was one of our priorities. We constructed the survey to be as private as possible, not just on that platform, but in general. For another round of examples, we didn't ask for very specific data. Instead of asking exact location, we asked for region and if the person was urban, suburban, or rural. And this was based on advice we were given to, not even if you do everything you can to be as secure as possible, to try to avoid identities being reconstructed from the data if it does potentially leak. With the data set and the list of questions somewhat finalized, we took the survey to the University of Chicago Social Science Division's IRB, Internal Review Board. This is basically a board that looks at your research plan, looks at your questions, looks at the project, and sees that it matches the requirements to be considered ethical research, that you're doing right as far as consent for the respondents, basically seeing if the project is on the up and up. And once we got that pass, we moved on to actually launching the survey. The survey was primarily distributed on social media, again, particularly Instagram, but also Discord servers, Reddit, and various listservs. And the goal here was something called snowball sampling, where you have one respondent take the survey and ideally tell other queer Muslims about it, and so forth and so forth. This was done because For reasons that I think are relatively obvious, it would be kind of impossible to just call up every single queer Muslim in the country or have that access to that and then randomly call various people to get a perfect even distribution. So this was the best way we could actually increase our reach and get a large number of people to respond. And we were expecting about 150 respondents. I remember Hamza saying 250 should totally be like ridiculously happy, over the moon. What we got was 682 responses after filtering out non-US residents, minors, other folks who wouldn't be qualified to take the survey, and trolls from 900. So a massive, overwhelming response. We were completely floored. Like, I don't know how many ways to say thank you for everyone here who took the survey and everyone not here who took the survey. And now I think we will move on to demographics, I believe. Hamza, I think that's you.
Yes, that is me. Thanks for that, Amara. Cool. So demographics. So before we kind of jump into chatting about some specific questions that we're looking at for our report, we want to paint a picture of who our respondents were so that you kind of can see that context as you look at the answers coming in. The caveat to this is in today's data drop, we're not actually going to be diving into the demographic analyses of each question that we're going to share with you with the report. That's going to be in the report. We're kind of doing that on purpose to kind of get you excited for the report and to kind of see that analysis. But also we don't want to sit for 3 hours here and look at every single demographic analysis. But in order to speak to demographics, we want to give you kind of a general overview. So I want to start off by saying we tried to anticipate the gaps as much as possible and all the gaps that we would get and work to prevent these gaps. And then we kept the survey open for 3 to 4 months, knowing that often with snowball sampling, more isolated and marginalized communities receive information later than the most connected. Having said that, we still have several gaps that showed up, and these gaps particularly show up when you compare them to surveys of US-based Muslims at large, which we'll talk through shortly. Faizan, if you can go to the next slide, we can start looking at the different demographics. So starting off with race, you see our respondent breakdown of race here. 7% of our respondents were Black, 30.1% of our respondents were Central or South Asian, 6.2% were multiracial, 29.9% were Southwest Asian, North African, 12% were white, and 14.9% were other. These included folks who identified as Latine or Indigenous and Native American. In terms of the gaps that we have when comparing them to a research study done by Pew Research Center, which was a survey of US-based Muslims, they found that 41% of US-based Muslims were white, which was a category that included those who described their race as Arab, Middle Eastern, Persian, or Iranian. 3 in 10, or 28%, were Asian, including folks from South Asia. 1/5, 20%, were Black. Fewer are Hispanic at 8%, and additional 3% identify with another race. So the most glaring gap in our data, in our demographics data, is Black respondents. And we want to acknowledge that our outreach and our general programming could have been stronger and better targeted to have a higher respondent rate from Black, queer, and trans Muslim populations. Be it kind of anti-Blackness that exists within Muslim communities and the isolation that queer and trans Black Muslims go through in queer and trans Muslim spaces, or general discrimination within the broader Muslim community that could influence participation to the type of spaces that we create, right? And our own limitations around outreach and the communities we're already tapped into. There's many reasons that could explain this gap, and any future research needs to prioritize tapping into Black communities to get a more accurate photo of Black, queer, and trans Muslim experiences. When it comes to age, you see a general breakdown that is reflective of the Muslim population as shown in the Pew Research study, except when it comes to respondents over 50. Whereas in our survey, we only had one of our respondents being 50 and over. In the same research study that I cited from Pew Research Center, we saw 60% of the Muslim American adult population between 18 to 39, and 14% were over 55. So we have a clear gap when it comes to age as well. And there's multiple reasons why this could be the case, right? We relied on online platforms to reach our audience, and that is largely geared towards a younger crowd. Between Instagram and TikTok, that's more tailored towards a younger crowd as opposed to an older crowd. And it was mostly digital, right? So we missed out on our elder population there. Moving on to the next slide. When it comes to gender and sexual orientation, the Pew Research Center's study does not have much data on this. So we actually put forward our study as a solid baseline of the diversity of US-based Muslims when it comes to at least the queer and trans part of them, right? So our respondent pool was very colorful. Funny pun intended. We have 18% of our respondents as trans, 40% were non-binary, 3% were intersex, and 53% were cis. In terms of sexuality, sexual orientation, we had 21% of our respondents were lesbian, 20% were gay, 41% were bi, 6% were questioning, 10% were ace, 3% were straight, and 56% were queer. So queer nirvana, one might say. Next slide is our regional distribution and kind of the type of environment that our respondents were living in. So you'll see that we had a solid distribution across the US. In the report that we're going to launch, you'll actually see what these regional distributions refer to when it comes to states. But for the most part, our least representation was in the Rocky Mountains and in New England. I can't think of the states off the top of my head, but it'll be clearly kind of clarified in the report. The clearest gap that really came up, small sample size really that came up with suburban and rural divide, was in rural representation at only 4.9%. And a lot of this really ends up being small sample sizes, which we prioritize kind of sharing our analysis of, but it's important to say that with small sample sizes, our conclusions are not firm, right? These are analyses that we believe were important to point out because these are marginalized groups of people that aren't showing up a lot in the data, but that only pushed us to really highlight those analyses more. But we encourage you to take those analyses with a grain of salt and with an understanding that further research needs to happen for us to develop conclusions that are more firm. Moving on to the next slide. We have our convert and non-convert breakdown. 18% of our respondents were converts, 82% were non-converts, and people can really self-identify with how they describe themselves as convert or non-convert. Folks who are non-converts could have grown up in the faith and left the faith and didn't practice, or grown up in the faith and continue practicing in their own way, or cultural or only spiritual. For converts, different types of converts were included in that number. In terms of sex work and folks who've engaged in sex work, only 10% of our population engaged in sex work and 90% did not. Sex work here was expansive and people could describe sex work in many different ways. This include, many different ways. You'll see it in the top line. I can't think of it on the top of my head. But it was a pretty expansive definition of sex work. In terms of citizenship, 89% of our population were citizens, 11% were non-citizens. This was a gap in comparison to the Pew Research study that I mentioned of US-based Muslims. In their research, 18% of the US-based Muslim population were citizens. So we have kind of like a 7% gap in how many non-citizens were able to fill out our respondent pool. Many reasons to explain that, including trust issues, including feelings of safety with answering a survey on being queer and trans and Muslim, and the sense of safety that respondents could feel, among others. In terms of houselessness and experiences with houselessness, 20% of our respondent pool experienced houselessness and 80% did not. Yep, and then next slide. In terms of arrests and folks who have been arrested, only 8% of our respondent pool experienced an arrest. And this was defined in many different ways. So arrested in jail, was detained by different police agencies and actors, including immigration, including just city, state police. And this number also does not account for folks who are quote unquote on the inside, folks who are incarcerated. Our data and our survey is limited to folks who are in quote unquote the free world. So any kind of conclusions that we're making in relation to experiences with the carceral state, with policing, have a gap in the sense that they can only be further substantiated by interacting and getting data on folks who have experienced incarceration, who are on the inside, and reaching folks we weren't able to reach in this first pass. Then we have sect. We have a solid representation that is reflective of the national US-based Muslims survey. It's important to note that Ismaili is part of kind of the umbrella of Shia. So look at that data point within that. But it is a solid breakdown of the different sects that you see in larger survey projects for US-based Muslims. Next slide, please. You're good. Finally, income distribution. We saw more respondents who were making under 90K per year than above 90K. That doesn't necessarily tell us a lot about necessarily the communities that were tapped into, because in that kind of in that optionality of choosing your income bracket, students were choosing their income bracket, and we know that that could have skewed the data, given that most of our respondents were in the younger population. A large portion of them were students, but this was the kind of the income distribution on our end. Next slide. Cool. I think that's it on demographics. So that kind of gives you like a general picture of our demographic pool. But before we jump into kind of the findings, we want to ask a poll just to check that you're still paying attention. And I think Faison is about to pull it up on medical discrimination.
All right, I'm gonna share the results. So even just from our about a little under 40 something folks, that's a snapshot right now. It's great. 42% have not experienced this, and we're seeing 35% for your gender identity or sexual orientation, and 12% for perceived Muslim identity, and 12% for both. Gonna close this and pass it on to Amara.
Hey, folks. That poll, I mean, it's not exactly what we have, but it's not super dissimilar. But yeah, let's get into the actual questions that we asked. The first one we're going to talk about, and we're only talking about, by the way, a small section of the ridiculous number of questions that we have. So there will be more in the future. But for now, we specifically wanted to see about experiences of medical discrimination. So we asked respondents, have you ever been discriminated against by a medical professional for being LGBTQI plus? And in parallel, in a different question, we asked, have you ever been discriminated against by a medical professional for being Muslim? And one of the things that I think is immediately apparent from this is that these two are actually rather similar looking, like just looking at the shape of everything. They're pretty similar. And that includes when you add up all those different yeses that you see on there. If you add up all those yeses, you get 21% discrimination for being LGBTQI plus and 18% discrimination for being Muslim. And for both, the discrimination was more recent in the last 5 years primarily. Another part of this is that the don't knows are similar, with 14% for discrimination for being LGBTQI plus and 19% for being Muslim. I want to emphasize these don't knows because, particularly in a medical context, having a don't know response makes it it signals a negative experience potentially that left the respondent unsure. Is there an echo? That me? If there is, I'm going to have to keep talking through it.
I think you're good.
Okay. Oh, my Alexa is talking. There. But yes, the don't know responses should actually be considered alongside the yeses as not the firm no. Ideally, in a medical setting, you want those firm no responses that are around 2/3. Could we have the next slide? So one of the things we wanted to do with this data is look at it intersectionally, like actually acknowledge LGBTQ Muslims as like LGBTQ Muslims, not either or, which is a tendency that exists in quite a bit of research. The American Center for Progress is one of the exceptions. They do every few years state of the LGBTQ community, and it is noticeable how much our results are closer to theirs than other averages. Looking at this view where we have both together, you see that despite the fact that the previous two graphs looked very similar, they didn't overlap completely. We have a 8% for yes to both versus larger categories for the other two. And when you add these two together, you also end up with nearly 1/3 of respondents experiencing some sort of discrimination. And then finally, when we look at the ambiguous don't knows, we're at almost half. So when you actually look at the full possibility of LGBTQ Muslims medical discrimination experiences, you're left with half of the people feeling like they've been discriminated against or unsure. And yeah, this was a big surprise to me, especially since as researchers, we saw that first graph initially. Okay, can we move on to the next question? These two graphs are a bit more straightforward. We asked respondents if they agreed or disagreed with the following. There is a stigma around conversations around sexual assault within the Muslim community, and then separately, there is stigma around conversations about sexual health and reproductive services within the Muslim community. And we asked this question because these are both very pressing issues currently, and I think a lot of us expected there to be agreement. We did not expect this near universal level of agreement, with 9 out of 10 agreeing to both type of stigmas, and those ambiguous don't knows being even higher than the people who disagree. I also want to highlight these questions because it's a matter of, if we have these stigmas, it's not just an individual issue. It's not just this person felt like they couldn't talk to it, or that someone wouldn't talk to them about them to it. It's a community issue. It means we can't get knowledge to those who need it, even when there's great tools like Hart's Muslim Guide to Healthy Sex and Relationships. If folks aren't talking about these things, the recommendation of such good resources is less likely to happen. And for LGBTQI plus Muslims, it shuts down the conversation nearly entirely, because you can't talk about queerness, you can't talk about transness, and thus it doesn't get addressed. And for the sexual assault stigma in particular, it is also important from an educational perspective, but it's important additionally important because Muslim spaces are trusted spaces and violations of that need to be addressed. And again, this is going to be a theme. This goes doubly so for LGBTQ Muslims who are already often marginalized in their communities and thus particularly vulnerable. And we can move on to the next slide. And I believe that's back to Hamza, unless I'm reading things wrong.
Yep. Now we're gonna wrap up that section. So that was 1/3 of our findings. We're now moving on to the next third, and Hamza will introduce that for us.
Cool. I think we have a poll. So this next section really has to do with relations to policing and surveillance. And we're going to look at experiences with policing and police agents and police agencies, and then doubling it down to looking at sentiments, right, and feelings about surveillance and interactions with policing agencies. But before we do that, we want to just ask a poll just to make sure that we're all on the same vibe here, that we all are agreed about how we feel about these particular institutions. This is the poll. Feel free to choose an answer. Nothing is really wrong, but yeah.
I will say people responded to this like much more quickly.
So fast.
than
Oh
the
my
other
God.
ones. People have strong feelings. And pleading the fifth means, I think, not implicating yourself. So kind of neutral, not even neutral, just I'm not going to respond just in case.
It's okay. We know though. We know. Cool. I think that
we appreciate the indulgence and we're sharing results.
dope. Nice. None of us eat pork here. Cool. Next slide. So we're going to start off with a question that you already saw in the demographic breakdown, which was a simple question. Have you been arrested? 8% said yes, 92% said no. Overall, our sample size is small. And I say that because it needs to be emphasized in that in the report, we kind of analyze demographically what the implications of folks who've said yes, what are the demographic breakdowns of everyone who said yes. But because the sample size is small, the conclusions that we arrive to are not firm, and yet we're not speaking to the demographic breakdown today, but they're still striking, and you still see a pattern emerge when we look at the demographic analysis and the comparative demographic analysis. So we're looking at roughly 40 respondents who said yes, they've been arrested. Next slide, Faiza. When looking at the experiences of our respondents with, all cops are bastards. Or, yeah, I just answered the question that I saw, sorry. And so these two questions are really asking about the experiences of our respondents with policing agents and actors. And they come in two forms, right? So for those who said that they were arrested, we asked if our respondents believed that they were arrested, at least in part, due to any of the following. And respondents could mark any of the answers that applied, be it for being Muslim, for their sexuality or sexual orientation, for their gender identity, or for their racial and or ethnic identity. So a host of protected classes, if we're using kind of legal terminology. 48% of our respondents who did get arrested said yes, that they were arrested, at least in part, due to discrimination based on a protected class. When we're looking at general interactions, so for folks who did not get arrested, right, but had general interactions with federal, state, and or local law enforcement, we saw that 52% said yes, that those general interactions had discrimination based on a protected class in them. 35% said no, and 14% said don't know. Like Amara mentioned earlier, we're really interested also in the don't knows, because not having a clear answer on whether you experience discrimination or not already tells you something about that experience, right? It tells you that there was some gray area there where someone felt a level of discomfort, but might have not potentially pinpointed it as some type of discrimination. So what this data ultimately tells us, in the next slide, Faizan, is that 1 in 2 people are experiencing discrimination with policing agencies, be it in general interactions or in direct arrests. And the findings serve as a clear call for immediate action, right? There's a clear need to engage in targeted abolitionist organizing and policy work, trauma-informed intervention and harm reduction methods that do not rely on policing systems and institutions, or punitive approaches, as well as communal advocacy efforts that center the most marginalized, right? We know that the cops are not going to keep us safe. They were never intended to keep us safe. And this data only supports that assertion. And we join, as we have in the past, calls for abolition. And another note that I want to point out, that I pointed out in the demographics, is that there are limitations in the ways that we've asked the questions, right? So these experiences are only speaking to those that are in the quote unquote free world, right? They're not accounting for folks who have been incarcerated, who are behind bars, right? And doing research with those populations will only substantiate these claims and our calls to action and our calls for abolition, but will give us a much clearer picture of the levels of discrimination, dehumanization, and violence that our communities go through, especially within a context of anti-Muslim racism and anti-Black racism. Cool. That's that one. I'll pass it on to Amara.
Okay, sorry about that. My mouse died and I had a backup because I always have a backup. Okay, the continuing on from sort of the experiential understanding of the stuff that has been happening to queer and trans Muslims, we also wanted to get an understanding of some of the sentiments. Particularly, we wanted a measure of trust or lack of safety, so that we could understand exactly what the effects of policing have been on queer Muslims. And unsurprisingly, as you can see by the large no, over or about 3 in 4 did not feel safe reporting to any type of policing. When we asked, do you feel safe around or reporting to the police, immigration officers, and/or Department of Homeland Security? By the way, this was multiple choice. So that's why if you add these all together, it is a bit over 100%. And when you looking at that no, when again we take in those don't know responses, we end up very high with a number around 86. So with this measure of trust, we wanted to see this in comparison to others. Looking again at Pew, we looked at one of their closest questions, which is, how confident are you that the police will act in the best interest of the public? This was asked of the general population and is another measure of trust, even if it isn't an exact same sort of measure as this one. What was interesting is that when they asked the general population this in 2021, 69% of the general population said they had a great deal or a fair amount of confidence that the police would act in the best interest of the public. I think if I remember, it was down about 10% from the year before. Just putting that out there. But importantly for this data, it was quite a flip from what we're seeing here. And that, as I mentioned, not super surprising. Still go back. I have one last thing to say about this, which is that we asked this question not because we think that LGBTQ Muslims and the police need to get along, but because we wanted to get a sense of how histories of police abuses in the past, the actual experience of this in people's lives, the knowledge of it happening to people, the people that queer Muslims know, like how has this actually affected it? Policing in America has horrible roots and it produces horrible results. So when we ask about trust, it's not on the assumption that folks should trust the police. We just wanted this measure. We wanted to confirm that the roots of policing for LGBT lead to a reasonable mistrust of policing agencies because our lives are vulnerable to them and our lives are damaged by them. Now we can move on to the next one. This question was particularly important to me in that a good part of my research outside of Queer Crescent focuses on how marginalized communities are able to find belonging online, to make spaces online. And you generally need to have some confidence that it is a safe space. That's one of the foundations of community. And that's hard when you are worried about surveillance. And to figure out how this affects LGBTQ Muslims, we asked with respondents if they would say what frequency at which they would say that there was a sense of understanding or government surveillance in their life, creating a source of anxiety. And yet again, there's a pretty small no, only 11%, just over 1 in 10. And when you add up all the different yeses, you're over almost 9 in 10 Muslims, queer LGBTQ Muslims, experiencing surveillance anxiety. And even if we discount, for example, the rarely responses for yes constantly, that's 1 in 5. That's a significant amount. And in addition to what I already mentioned about finding communities online, which LGBTQ Muslims do significantly, like it's a major part of how especially younger LGBTQ Muslims find community because of being pushed out or excluded from other potential communities in person. There is, of course, the history of surveillance being deployed against marginalized people in the United States. We immediately think of 9/11, and I especially think of 9/11 because of a particular example of gay Muslims being targeted at surveilled mosques to be roped into potentially being informants. But there's a longer history that goes back to things like COINTELPRO spying on civil rights activists. And further back, if we had full time, I would give a history lesson. But I'm not going to give you a history lesson. The important thing to think about when looking at these results is that marginalized people deserve to live and organize free without the hovering potential of state intrusion. And yet again, this goes doubly for LGBTQ Muslims because they are affected from being pushed out from Muslim communities and potentially not feeling nearly as connected to or even excluded in more secular LGBTQI plus spaces. In addition to that, like both groups are somewhat united in that being Muslim and being LGBTQ is inherently political in our current environment. It inevitably makes these people targets, which makes this surveillance anxiety question not a question about paranoia, but a question about reasonable suspicion given things that have happened in the past. And can we move on to the next slide? Okay, we have another poll and another quote, which, by the way, from the qualitative data, like the qualitative responses, this was possibly my favorite response. Just putting that out there, the thing in quotations. But the other aspect of this poll is that I wanted to end the survey with a very specific question, which was, do you take care of a cat? We did not have room for this. So this quick poll here is my recompense. So please make sure to answer with the correct answer. And you know what that is. I'm watching the results right now.
I so appreciate the chats. Thank you. We are We are 2/3 done with our findings. Our next one is on belonging and religiosity, and we're going to share these results. I think Amara will be happy to see. Many folks will take care of their cat. And
I'm unhappy with 10% of people.
I'm gonna pass it on to Hamza now. Thank you.
Shanaz. Cool. So we're going to take you through some of our belonging data. And this is really the part of the survey and this report specifically, where we dive deeper into how people feel when it comes to their belonging to queer community, to Muslim community, what they're actually doing with that belonging, right? On an organizational level, if they're reaching out, they're tapping into resources, or not. Next slide, Faison. So we asked our respondents two questions. It was a scale of agreement, right? And we asked them if they agreed or disagreed with the following two statements. The first was, I feel a strong sense of belonging to the LGBTQ plus or queer community / movement in the US. And then the second statement that we asked them to agree or disagree to was, I feel a strong sense of belonging to the Muslim community in the US. So just for my visual learners in the room, you're already seeing the data skewed in different directions when you're looking at the graphs. And then if we go into the next slide, Faison, we'll actually notice that in 10, queer and trans Muslims do not feel belonging to queer spaces, while 3 and 5 do not feel belonging in Muslim spaces. So we see that queer and trans Muslims tend to feel slightly more connected to the LGBTQ plus queer community than the Muslim community. And that paints a very clear picture of the comfortability that queer and trans Muslims feel when it comes to having to kind of choose one of those communities, right? And that brings us to this idea of double bind, right? That framework that we borrow and witness within our communities from what we've learned within survivors of sexual violence spaces, right? So the double bind is a place that queer and trans Muslims often find themselves in, where they're almost forced to choose one of two identities, one of two communities, in trying to come to terms with their full selves. While that is the case in the data, it is only a narrow majority that agree that they feel a sense of belonging with queer and trans community. So while these data points are different, they're still discouraging on both accounts, right? Less than half the population of our respondents agreed with the statement that they feel a sense of belonging with queer and trans community, meaning that most don't, right? And when looking at our top line, and this is this is data that wasn't part of our report, but you'll find in the top line report, we found that 8 in 10 queer and trans Muslims actually avoid Muslim communities because they believe they would be unwelcomed or prejudiced against due to them being LGBTQ, right? So it's no mystery why people are deferring to not engage with the Muslim community. We can say with certainty that at least with our respondent pool, 8 in 10 of them said of the folks that avoid Muslim community, they do it because they feel unwelcomed, and that they feel that they will experience discrimination in these spaces. So there's a real problem that comes out of the data here. Next slide.
All right, so I am seeing our data form needs permission. I'm gonna tag Saba or Delia to please work on that for us. I'm so sorry. Thank you, Saba. I really appreciate Asata you checking on that. And segueing from what Hamza mentioned about how 8 in 10 queer and trans Muslims are in fear, essentially, of going to Muslim spaces, we also asked a question: are you a member of or regularly attend a spiritual religious space like a mosque or Islamic center? Now you'll see that a little under 30% of folks do not, which means they're not members or do not attend. and regularly can be interpreted in a lot of different ways subjectively. And so here, we can't assume whether it's a weekly or a yearly attendance. But this is much lower than the national average of any religiously affiliated group. The top four that were studied by Gallup in 2020 were folks part of Hinduism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And 47% of folks from those groups were members. And so this also tells us this is not just a situation for certain mosques. It is very nationwide, even when compared. We also asked, and these are the last two questions we'll talk about in our findings, the importance of connecting and finding belonging in at least one of your identity spaces. So we asked whether folks had connected with Muslim LGBTQ or LGBTQ friendly Muslim spaces, such as affirming mosques or support groups. And the other question we asked was if you had ever connected with an LGBTQ support group or nonprofit. Now, this could have been an LGBTQ center in the area, a healthcare center, etc. What we're seeing is by far, folks are most connected and reaching out to LGBTQ organizations. However, what we'll see next is Muslim LGBTQ folks, we see 44% have said yes out of our respondent pool compared to 29% in the previous question. Now that is already a 15% jump, regardless of how many mosques, Islamic centers we have in the US. There's over 2,000. However, only 18 LGBT Muslim groups were named in our survey from folks. And so even with the limited number of these spaces that are often not in rural centers, they're often very localized. Some of them don't even have digital places to meet. They are still seeing a lot more attendance and contact because of the explicit affirmation, like, hey, it's okay, you belong. But even beyond that, it's okay, it's a lot of co-creation of making home together. As you'll also see, about 68% of our respondents have reached out to and connected with LGBT orgs. This is a great number. It is 24% higher than if you've connected with Muslim LGBT orgs, and that is still notable. Is it visibility? Is it resources? Or is it just wanting an a-religious space? We don't know this fully, but we do have a lot of qualitative data that's telling us it is not just about the leadership. It is very much about the people you see day to day. Who do you see in the mosque? Who welcomes you in? What do they say? What is the physical environment like when 65% of mosques in the US are gendered? They have been 65% since 2000. This has not changed in the last 24 years. It's a very binary place. We ask ourselves constantly, and even out of our group at work, we talk about who's still involved, why not, why are they? And these are really important things for us all to think about. So now we are going to close that out. We have shared a lot of information, and we're very grateful for your time, your attention,